Good morning. This is the Blaine's World podcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. We're also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. Uh, you name it, you can find us. You can also get more information at our website, which is seen in the back of me, www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, and he is Anthony Abraira. Is I pronunciation right?
Yes.
And Anthony, you can wave to all you fans and friends who are watching this. So that is Anthony Abraira. And I don't know Anthony real well, but I do know he's a real theater guy who's an actor, director, I guess, producer, you name it, involved in theater, you're somehow involved in it. And so what I always ask Anthony when I start talking to somebody the first time is, as a child, you grew up where?
I was born and raised in Hialeah, Florida, Little Havana.
Okay, and when you were,
Um,
yeah, I'm sorry, when you were born and raised there, did you always know you wanted to be in theater?
oh no. Completely accidental. The school that I was in, St. John the Apostle, at the time, was doing what they were calling an elocution contest. At the time, I don't know what that was. Alan's, like poetry by Alan Silvestri, and that kind of child oriented poetry. And I did like anybody else in the class, I just did my take of it. I didn't even really prepare. I mean, I memorized it, but I just prepared. And yeah, I was like stunned to know that I was like at the top, the selected three that will then go to the final round. And then in the final round, I ended up taking, the first prize. And then I did it again the following year. And I started to go, okay, this is something that I actually have a capacity for. So
What did you do? What was the reading?
um actually, the one that I actually remember the lines in the poem, but I'm not really sure. It was there stood my mother with a harp against her shoulder. I'm actually zooming it right now. The Ballad of the Harp Weaver by Edna St. Vincent Millay was the
Okay.
one that was the last one that I did. And it was it was weird because it was, I think, selected by me or my dad. I mean, he and I were kind of like doing it. He was trying to help me out, but he was giving me something that was about like a late teenager remembering his mother that passed away, and how she tried her best to feed him despite the poverty and the struggle. So there was like a lot of like life lessons that I had to kind of understand, or like predicaments and mature themes essentially. And but yeah, and it was like that really opened things up, because I was like, well, this is a hell of a way to process experience. And I was drawing at the time, so then I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, I can see where performing is like an extension of something new. And but yeah, that's basically how it all happened. Totally bamboozled by the fact that it did happen at the
And
time.
what's cool about it, you were just looking at, you actually have a copy of what you did there. The reading, it was taped.
Oh god, no. I mean, we're talking
Oh,
about, let's see, so this must have been 1991. Like, this was a while ago, and the nobody really had the
right.
technology. I mean, I'm gonna be 43 this year, so yeah, I do have the papers though. Like, I still have the original poetry stuff. My mom has all that stashed up, and you can see all these little annotations and things like that. And yeah, it's endearing at this point. Yeah.
Well, keep that in mind because Anthony, I had this great idea for some theater company, and you guys could be one of the first ones to do this, but everybody would recreate their very first role, so that since you don't have a record of it, wouldn't it be cool that if you made a record of it now, 30 years later or something, and then you could at least show this to other people, so just keep that in mind. We can make a comeback with that particular reading, but transition that, if you would, into your first then venture into theater. So you took that reading, you then got
Mhm.
into theater. How so?
Well, I left Hialeah shortly after. Uh, well, let me back up. I was there till I was in 5th grade, and then I moved to West Palm Beach. And honestly, the theater thing took a bit of a hiatus because at the time I was also getting into computers and technology, and I was kind of going through a culture shock because I thought everybody was Latin, when I was living in Hialeah, and then I moved and I discovered Caucasians.
And everybody's not, you're teaching me something here. Everybody's not Latin. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure that there are Americans there, but I was stunned. Like, I remember that the real culture shock I had was I was so used to like being told to, like, oh, when you're at someone's house, you have to, you usually kiss the mom, how are you? Nice to meet you. It's a sign of respect. And then when I started doing that, they were like, oh, look at this. Who is this foreigner? So I had to go through a bit of a learning curve. But at that point, I was really into books, and I started to get my feel for storytelling. I just started to like the whole medium of storytelling at the time. And at the time, I think I was mostly into comic books. So in a weird way, like, I was also getting into storyboarding. So this idea of being able to like efficiently tell stories started to gestate. Theater started to get hold again right around the time I was about a sophomore in high school. I revisited it, and just auditioned for a play. And again, the same kind of thing as the elocution contest. I was given the lead, and I was like, okay. So I ended up doing it was like a dinner theater thing, like a function that was done for the high school. So like everybody was brought, like families were brought into the auditorium. They were serving like cheap lasagna or something like that. And we did these I think we did it for 2 nights. And we did this performance basically where a murder occurs and everybody has to like participate in assisting, the lead detective, and the notable thing about that was that there were 3 seniors that were in the play. I forgot this girl's name. I'm glad I did because it's not a great anecdote, but she was the one that was supposed to be the suspect. And I'd say maybe 10 minutes into the play, it's an hour and a half play. 10 minutes into the play, she gave out a line. Like, she literally read off something from the final pages of the script. And everybody was like looking at each other because it was like there were so many revelations that just were unfolded, and there was enough time in the setup for everybody to know, that the audience, for everybody to know what basically the punchline was. And there was like this real, I'll never forget it because there was this like, time stood still. I didn't know what to do. And I basically broke into this demeanor where I was like, I got to bring it back. But if I'm going to convince anybody, I have to now be the detective that can't remember. So then I just started building this right on the fly, this persona in which a lot of lines that were supposed to be like questions for the person as I'm jotting things down became like the same questions on purpose, so they can be like, I just told you that. It's like, and basically I built this whole cacophony that worked. It somehow worked. Like, it was, it really, like, apparently, like, it was, I remember I was because I went to a place called Cardinal Newman in West Palm Beach, and that's like where the rich kids go. And I was approached by at the time by Jim McNamara, and he's the father. He was the father of a girl there that attended the school, and I believe she was in the cast. And it's one of those moments where I should have said yes or whatever, but I got pulled aside. He was in the process of producing the Fugitive, the television series that was a spinoff from Harrison Ford's movie. And he asked me if I wanted to go to Los Angeles. And at the time, like, like I said, it was like me just jumping back into the play was just happening. And I was not in the mindset for it or whatever. Again, one of those things where I probably should have said yes. But that's when theater actually started to become like, okay, let me really see if I can hone in on this medium of performance. And I kind of diverted away from drawing and visual arts, and I started to make a formal transition into like movie making and script writing and so forth. And anyway, yeah, so high school is basically when the theater thing climbed in.
By the way, that's another production I would love to have seen a record of. Can you imagine if we
Oh
had...
God, I would pay good money for that. I
Well, I'm
would
saying,
pay good.
no, but back to my idea seriously, and we'll have to pick up this one woman. But can you imagine it, and not just you, but everybody would recreate one of their first roles, and so you were in high school. Some people would be a tree in first grade or something. It would just be kind of fun to have everybody do that. And I think, it'd be a way to raise some funds for a theater that everybody sees the first performance,
I could see it being very interesting, especially if the roles were insignificant, like a
Right.
tree, and being like,
Yeah.
well, you're gonna have to like bring those basic lines that you had, if you had any lines, as tree, and then say, but overlay that and write something original about you as this person now in relation to when you were a tree. And I'm sure there's some beautiful opportunities for poetry.
By the way,
Uh,
this reminds me of a film I just saw, and you may have seen it too, as a theater camp. Have you seen that yet?
no, actually, it's weird. I just saw something on my feed about this.
Yeah, it's
My news feed. Is it
the
good?
best. Yeah, we're talking about it's a mockumentary. It's not real, but it could be real. Everybody's first
Hmm.
performance, they go to summer camp, they do these elaborate productions. See if you get a chance, you get a kick out of it. So you did that in high school, and then you kept performing after that?
Yeah. Then I started to I went into a modeling stint for a little bit just because I had a lot of connections. My family was still in Miami, and that scene was definitely growing. The fashion scene, the art scene. That's when Art Basel and all these things were starting to really pick up pace. And I don't know. I Since I was already a designer, a graphics designer, and a layout person. Um, I found myself kind of interweaving that design world with opportunities that arose just being near. It's like a Woody Allen thing. A lot of it is just showing up. So I had a couple of opportunities to do some modeling work, mostly for events that were being held in Miami. But other than that, I would go to like the Lake Worth Playhouse, which was my local theater that was just a few miles away from where I lived. And they were the ones that were the most open about auditions. And they used to have this little black box theater. I forgot what it was called. Stanzek Theater. That's what it was called, which was adjacent to the Lake Worth Playhouse. It's still there. And I got casted to do Extremities. And which I don't know if you know, is Marianne Masterson or something like that, is the one about the rapist that gets like,
Okay, I do know it.
like,
Yes.
yeah. So the guy, Pat Mackin, he passed away a few years ago, but he did it with two casts because there was such a turnout for the auditions. And what happened was he already had casted the older cast. I would say, like people my age at this point. And but me and this girl Alexandra West, we apparently did really well because we did the actual scene where we were like very, very physical, and we were incredibly friendly. Like we were already like developing a close friendship because we bantered well together. And because of that kind of immediate chemistry, he's like, all right, I'm going to do two shows. And so we did, it was sort of an on and off thing.
Right.
So like a Thursday was the young, then the Friday was the older. And, just did that for 3 weeks. Hard show, hard show. It was like, because it was a rapist and a person obviously who wasn't mentally well. And but we we did those performances. And there were a couple of times actually that, because this director, I don't know, this he taught me what limits are, because he definitely flirted with them. So like I was tearing off a woman's blouse in the middle of the theater. I was, we had to coordinate like how to do a choke, coordinate how to pretend that I was punching. So I learned all these physical things and so forth, and vice versa. At one point, I accidentally broke the girl, like, sort of broke the girl's nose, or had her, had a nosebleed. She gave me a black eye in another performance, inadvertently with a rod. So I mean, it was really like definitely like too far.
Well,
But go ahead.
no, it was also too far. It was before they had intimacy coordinators.
Yeah,
They know that term or whatever. So
no
anything I
doubt.
guess went. Wow, that was something.
Yeah,
So you
yeah. We
learn
got
what
we got yeah. What up?
no, you learn what not to do, I guess, right?
Well, what I started to learn was that there is such a way to not over direct, but direct to an extreme, no pun intended. That, I mean, we had a couple of instances where somebody would rush the stage. Like we had one that, because they thought the rape was real, like they thought the assault had sort of left the theater realm, and it became something. Oh, this is a problem. And Pat was there the first time and actually stopped them midway. I mean, he got right up to my face before he was like drawn back or whatever. And then, we continued on. But then it became almost like his position to be a watcher. And then at one point, her and I by ourselves without him, because he eventually, like, by the time it was the second week and the third week of the run, we were able to like be on our own. I would start talking with her and being like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. I want you to have control over this. So, I'm going to put my hand here and then you got to do the thrashing, or you, like when she punches like walls, I'd be like, okay, like, can you actually, can you just change that and not slap me for real? I'm okay with that. So it became a really cool crash course of intimacy coordinator. It was funny you're saying that because I just learned that term from like a Wikipedia search. I was like, oh, would have been nice to have that.
Right, that's what I'm
So
thinking. Well, I'm listening to these stories, and you tell great stories, by the way, that there's almost for your, I don't know if you have original play, but this could be your first play, or your
you're right.
story.
I hadn't thought of it actually, but yeah, that would be
I
a hell
mean,
of a
it's
play.
fascinating, and just you have a great memory, it seems like. Do you have a good memory in general?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because we'll talk about that in terms of dialogue and stuff like that. But just your recreation of details is incredible. So you did that show, Lake Worth, Florida. What got you to the Asheville area?
Well, I went to Spain for almost a couple of years. I was at that point, I had kind of leaned in heavy on design, and I was there was other theater things that happened before that, but leading up to that part of the story, um, where I was an art director for this magazine in southern Spain called Mint, and I was there basically doing like the primary product development, the marketing structures, how the advertising models and all this sort of things were going to be put together. So I was there. I was leaving a sort of uh, I kind of wanted to really leave home. That's just me. I've always wanted to not be alone, but I loved what it's like to be places that don't know you or don't have the history trailing you, or the family telling you this is what I remember you always were, et cetera, et cetera. Not that it was any toxic level to it, but I just realized that I wanted the next phase of my life to be a lot about adventure and, self-discovery and so forth. So I was in Spain for that time. I traveled around. I did work assignments for that company and a few others. So I found myself in Amsterdam for a few weeks. I found myself in Paris for almost a couple of months, and Frankfurt for a stint. So forth. But anyway, so I was doing that, and then I was like, you know what? I'm gonna come back. The company that I was working with was like really, really connected with like the Emirates, and the Emirates were very much a group that was dominating the southern coast of Spain, and they're like close proximity to the Dubai crowd, and this was a time right before the 2008 financial recession, so a lot of black money from Russia was coming in and infusing the economies of southern Spain. So there was a lot of posh happening, and basically the platform of the magazine was to exploit this new demographic of money to see if there was a way to, like one of our clients was Van Cleef, the diamonds guy. There were, parties that I went to where last names were Bin Laden, and it had nothing to do with the terrorists. It was because they run the power companies and they are part of the resource extraction organizations there. It was to a world where I was like, man, this actually makes money look tacky. Like you know what I mean? Like you can take it to that degree. And so I just went through a bit of a crisis of conscience. And that's why I decided to start exploring a bit of Europe, and then found myself coming back to Florida. My parents had already packed up everything in my room. I mean, like they had done it like 2 weeks after I left, basically. And everything was like in a shower. They had turned off the shower and the piping, and so they could just stuff all this stuff in. And I was like, great. And they're like, oh, look around Florida. I'm like, nah. So they had a place over in Wolf Laurel in
Sure, I
a
know it.
little bit north of in Mars Hill, and I stayed there for a few weeks, and then I found a place over in Marshall, and then that started me in living in Western North Carolina. I started in Marshall and then found my way to Asheville, and I've been here since then. So 2008, 7, 8 that time.
So update me, if you will, from 2008, then in West North Carolina. How'd you get back into theater, or how'd you get into theater in this area?
Um, I had done. I'm trying to think because I have a. It's weird because I'm a bit of a. I'm gonna be cautious here. I am a bit of a snob. Like I like to know what the plays are. Um I guess because I was really reading theater at the time, and I was like exploring like stories, story theory like McKee and Sid Fields, Dramatica, and I was really getting this sort of educational overlay over the notion of how storytelling is done and why it arose, and essentially like that great stories are great arguments. Whereas in contrast to a tale is just a story of incidents that don't necessarily amount to a moralistic outcome, or I'm sorry, a moral theme. So I was really imbued in that. So I flirted and always looked around, went to the Montford Players. I would check what was going on in all the theater scenes that I could find. There were a couple of things over at the, I think at the time it was the BB Theater or
Right.
something like that.
Still is. Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, and it's like I said, I don't want to sound like a snob, but I was into it. I just wasn't buying into it. And then there was a thing at the NC stage, which was some sort of opportunity for writers to write their short plays. And I got mixed in with a show where I was some sort of alcoholic golf instructor at a resort, and I was basically the commentator on the dysfunctional relationships that were occurring, with the other characters that were actually the leads in that. I was just sort of like, moving things along. And it was fun. But I really started to like confront the fact that I'm like, wow, like there's a reason those plays that I was in before were really enthralling. I had no idea what great writing was. I had no idea that there is actually a musical nuance, a certain mastery of delicate nature in which good writing is seductive. And I've noticed that, and like I said, this is no comment on the show that I was in or anything like that, but I could just see, you know what I mean? Like I can see that there was a gamut, and I basically discovered that there was one. And then in a way that was like the separation between amateur and professional, if you want to call it on those two terms. And then it became so I did that play, and then honestly, like I think I may have again shooed away from the theater, not from the theater scene, but from like trying to be a performer. And then I started getting into filmmaking, and I started doing like commercial work because that was an easy tie-in because I was already doing design, so it was an easy lead-in. So I did some work for a sherry wine producer in Spain that's called Lustau, and and started editing. And in the editing I started getting into like storytelling and like seeing what salvage footage or footage of documentary stuff could lead itself into stories that were not necessarily as apparent when you looked at the original raw footage. Yeah, and then that's sort of around the time when it started to lead into me orbiting to, well, I want to make films. And then the thing from making films became a bit problematic because it was a deep sense of collaboration with a lot of moving parts and certain learning curves that I hadn't yet embarked on. Audio engineering, post-production color grading, like, I know the concepts of it because I know Photoshop and all these things, but I have just, even now as we're doing this, like I haven't yet put both my feet into complete overhaul mastery of the film medium, because Shakespeare and Friends started to gain my attention because they were at least dealing with classical plays. And maybe that's why I kind of did the Midsummer, and then from Midsummer did the Crucible, because I was like, well, this is actually a foothold in the thing that I really love, which is story. And film is an outcome. Theater is an outcome of story, but story is the thing that starts it. And no matter how I skin the cat, when I was doing the film work and trying to make like these little short films and so forth, I realized, wow, like the real limit of most of these films is the fact that most of these filmmakers, and I mean, there's still great, amazing new films coming out every year. There's amazing new talent that is coming into the scene. But one thing that they have in common is that they understand certain conventions of storytelling to a degree in which they have the capacity to be original. Whereas in contrast to being emulative, which is what I started to notice in both the theater, when I was like doing the plays and watching people that were writing their own things, and then the films that I was trying to make, finding within myself my own limits of going, wait a minute, I'm just recreating a scene from Reservoir Dogs, and or I'm just trying to reconstruct this monologue that I loved in Sense of a Woman, and I'm trying to reverse engineer an arbitrary scene to make it happen. And I was like, oh, this is because I don't know. This is because I actually don't understand. And so now with this theater company, it has been sort of a fusion. I'm starting to see like emerging in the street a little bit, where it's like my story fascination is starting to become connected with execution. And uh, Hamlet Requiem, this play, is sort of an amalgamation of that focus, because there was a play that was very long. We were originally going to just buy an adaptation that was a shortened one that was basically built for students. And I looked at it and I was like, well, no, I think Hamlet actually could use an overhaul. In terms of storytelling, it has all the raw material inside of it, but as a story is told, we have evolved, and the humanities at this point do not need such long-winded explanations as to what is going to happen, or I would say clunky plot progression devices in which one person says one thing to one person, then one person says to, and that takes a lot of time. And I was like, well, I think people understand the nuances of sort of landing in the middle of a scene and then reverse engineering, enjoying the trauma, so to speak, of being disoriented at first because they're like, "Whoa, what's going on?" And then because to me, that's what good writing is that it brings in the audience to be a participant in the construction of what the implications of the story are. That's not spelled out. David Mamet wrote a book that blew my mind called On Directing, and he introduced this notion of juxtaposition. And at the time it was about film, but he was using this example of like, good film is not telling people everything. It's that you leave this little gap in between everything so that people can piece it together. So he used this example of like, say, you see a shot of a fist busting through a glass door, and then you cut, and then the next cut is a woman like raising her head, and you go, okay, what is it? You're like, oh, that's a woman being broken into her house. And he's like, okay, take out the broken fist scene, broken glass, change it to a gavel being slammed, cut to the woman putting her head up, and you're like, well, that's a woman about to await her judgment. And I was like, oh, because the in-between part is the part that needs to be vacant so that the audience can pour that in and go, got it. Whereas bad storytelling is not doing that.
As you're saying it, Anthony, it reminds me that's all his shows are like that too. It's just I can
Yes.
see it, and I love his shows, but they're not typical, kinds of shows that.
Mm-hmm.
And now I understand why somebody will have to read that book. Fast forward though back to what you're working on now. So right now you're with the name of the company again is Shakespeare and
Friends.
And explain what that company is and how that came about and how you got involved in it.
Well, I got involved in after the fact. It was founded by Michelle Newman, who is, I think, like kind of like at this point the coordinator of the tourism department in Tryon and so forth. But she was one of the founding members with Catherine Gillette. And Catherine is a playwright. She comes from the New York area. And I then met Andy Millard, which was another resident that lives over there. I believe he ran for city council just a year or so ago for the Democratic Party. And when I did Midsummer, that was just a nice little passing through, like a little tour thing. By the way, I forgot to mention, I did do one other play, which was Glengarry Glen Ross, where I done this with this like independent group at the Masonic Temple, which was the best venue.
Wait a second. Small World with Dan Clancy.
Yes, I love my
Oh,
Dan
it's
Clancy.
too funny. A good friend of mine. Oh, and I'm so someday we'll talk about Dan Clancy. Great guy. So
Oh,
that's where I then first saw you, and I love that show. I mean, what a show that was. I didn't remember meeting you then, but yeah, that was a great production. And
that was.
oh, is that Small World then? So yeah, Dan, good guy. So you did that production, and now I'm trying to recall which character you were, but I loved it. And
Roma.
what?
Roma.
And then the mistake, I think they made a mistake. Somebody else, another local theater company we won't mention, then did it like 5 years later with an all-female cast. I don't know. Did you see that?
Yes, I did.
Oh, you did. And no offense, didn't make it for me.
Well, the thing I got from that, I know who you're talking about. I know who produced it.
Yeah.
The thing about Mamet, just to
Right.
be brief, is that they're basically, he's writing about the primordial dimension of manhood in a way.
Right,
So a lot of his stuff is actually rooted in fact of male insecurities. And to me, Glengarry Glen Ross is a compilation of all the kinds of male insecurities that could
right.
exist. It's a big dissertation paper about what makes a man. And I found that to be I found it to be to just put women in to say, oh, here's diversity, to be like, yeah, but you're kind of missing the
Right.
thread of this. And Mamet does not allow. I was surprised because Mamet does not usually
Right,
allow,
but they got permission to do it. I think they had to.
because they couldn't change any words in it.
Oh, that
They
was it.
couldn't.
Yeah,
That was it. But at that point, it's like, well, now we're doing a reverse situation, like of what Shakespeare had during the
right,
Renaissance, where
right.
women couldn't play, and now the men can play. But you know,
Anyway, great. I agree with you.
A for effort, A for
Yeah,
effort. You know,
but I loved that. Now I remember the production. What a production that was, and it's just we'll have to get Dan back on in theater. I miss him in theater. Very
oh
fine.
God, I'm trying. I'm going to. I'm writing something. I'm not talking too much about it, but and he's in it. Like I'm like I wrote him in a role. I'm
Well,
like I want this guy
well,
back.
when speak to him, or I'll speak to him. Tell him we were talking about him on the air, and I'll send him a copy of this clip because he also wanted to do. And he and I talked about it. Never got off the ground. He wanted to do a Larry David show. I don't know if he ever told you about that. He's a big Larry David fan, and he was trying to get that off the ground and never did. But he is it was some quirky thing that Larry David put together. Anyway, back to we're getting away from Shakespeare. So
Sorry.
now I got the background, so now I do know you a little bit and some of the stuff you've been involved in. So you're doing now this production at where's it going to be? And it's coming upcoming.
The L venue in Asheville. In Spartanburg, I don't actually know the name of the venue. And then we're doing it at the Tryon Depot in Tryon.
And that's pretty cool that you're doing then. It makes it tough, I guess, in a little bit. You're doing it at three different venues, same production.
Yes, all theater in the round. Part of like what I'm trying to do for the theater thing, I've been developing this concept of a thing called gist theater, which is very bare bone, industrial, clean, surrounded by audience, more of a witnessing. It actually arose from Glengarry and Glen Ross because you know how that room was
Right.
sort of like a witnessing room, and it was almost like a courtroom. And I fell in love with it because I was like, part of what makes theater to me sort of a suspension of disbelief thing that I got to overcome is the proscenium structure of things, you know, where it's like, oh, here's the wall and everything happens this way. And I'm like, but that's not how life is. Life is catching a shoulder shrug, and that's only the body language you get. And then you know what I mean? So everybody would have this capacity. Like I remember in Glengarry and Ross, people would say, oh, I really was into your character and I was following you. And I was like, that's interesting because I played to your side of the stage more. And then I would go to other people and I would hear like, oh, you know, Dan Clancy was like, oh, that guy, I couldn't stop letting, or Alfie Highworth, he
Alfie,
was
yeah.
also in the show, and another brilliant actor. And I was like really amazed by this because I was like, maybe this is like an aspect of theater that needs to start happening, which is like sort of the informalizing of it and making it more like an extension of the way a TED talk is that meets a sort of Greek, you know, amphitheater lecture. Like it's less it's not that it's less performative, but it's less exhibitionistic. It's far more intimate and it's far more nuanced and just, and I'm a big person in acting where I'm like, I don't ham it up. Like, just stand still, put your arms down, say the line, opt for that 90% of the time. And you will be a gravitas to observe because the audience will search for what's going on within you rather than you broadcasting what you want them to think. Because then usually all that does is come across as either fake or you're doth protest too much, not so tied to Hamlet, but you know, where you're just like overdoing it. And then people go like, well, why are you overcompensating? You know, and then they play this other narrative about you and they try to make it seem like you're, you know, sort of doing a denial game with yourself about what you actually feel. But sorry, I went off the deep end there a little bit.
Join the
Uh,
crowd. So when people come see this production of Hamlet, I think you mentioned it opens on April 14th.
no, September 4th.
September 14th, April
Oh,
14th. So we missed a couple months there. So
yeah.
when it opens, to begin with, the dates are when, and do you have it in front of you, the dates and where they'll
Yeah.
be?
14th and 15th is going to be at the L venue in Asheville. If you give me 1 second, I will tell you the other ones in Spartanburg. Here we go. I'm at the Eventbrite page, so you can see how prepared I came for this. It's going to be over at the Mayfair Arts Studio in Spartanburg. That's going to be the 16th and 17th. It's a warehouse, so it's like I said, it's just going to be sort of a stripped down, seats surrounding, lights on the wings of things, and everything happens on the center, and there's no intermission on any of the shows. It's a sort of a tour de force, let the momentum take you, that kind of thing. And then afterwards, we're going to have a performance, a set of performances in Tryon, at the Tryon Depot, which is going to be on the 21st. Let's see here. It's going to start and I know it's starting in the 21st through the 24th, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
So how do people find out about these or get tickets?
They can go to shakespeare-friends.com/Hamlet, or they can Google search Hamlet the Requiem or Hamlet Requiem. And that is, usually what it brings up is the Eventbrite search result, because that's where we're platforming the ticket sales at this point.
Now you mentioned Hamlet the Requiem. So you were telling me off the air. So you're also now doing the adaptation of this as well?
Yes. So it's a 5-act play, I believe. It's 30,000 word play. So it's 3.5+ hours. And basically, like I was alluding to earlier, the thing that I love Shakespeare. I think it's going to go through a resurgence. I know right now it's going through its woke calamities, and
can you imagine? You can't teach it. You can't do the whole play in school. You can only read excerpts of it. What's wrong with that picture?
Yeah. I think the pendulum is going to find its correction in this, because there is no strong humanity that cannot withstand being disturbed and being insulted or being intimidated. That is the basis of growth. So if you're going to be coddled to the point that they're going to protect you, well, then thus begins the Orwellian nightmare in a very subtle way, because it comes as a comfort, which is very Huxleyan if you think about it. And like Brave New World, where the two arguments at play were that Brave New World said, hey, people will be given so many conveniences that they will be subdued, and then in the Orwellian one is like they will control the language and the language will do it. And I think it's sort of been a mixture in which the two theories are at a head-to-head battle, and there's no doubt that theater is undergoing a strain also, because the mediums are just plentiful and bountiful. But I believe what's going to happen is that because of that myopic focus on medium, in which people are imbued inside of a living room or in their headphones or so forth, I think what's happened is that they have thought of algorithmically making a personalized experience of the world to the degree in which nothing would insult them. And so there are technologies that have been able to provide that, and we're just sort of trying to interpolate that into living standard, into the living world. But I think theater might be at the precipice, just before the Phoenix Rising moment or whatever, upon when the theater, the media saturation will get to such a point that things are going to be more important about going to incidents, being present at a thing that happens. And that would require theater to go through its own renaissance of considerations like money, the overhead, the ability for it to have a sort of sharing capacity, the way the sharing economy has created all these sort of content creators. There's going to have to be a sort of democratization of theater, in which theater not only is about the plays that already existed, but also lead towards the way plays originally were. Because remember, back in the day when Renaissance era with Queen Elizabeth, they were basically creating the theater scene and developing their own mode of how to develop it on the teachings of Cicero, for example, and the concepts of Socratic methods of understanding of situations and so forth, the dissection of what these themes were important to create humanistic depictions of it. So I'm hoping theater finds itself a way to merge. So like, whereas right now you can go to a protest and it's basically an event of self-righteousness,
Right.
right? Or you can go to a flash mob or be in the midst of a flash mob, and then you have novelty. And I think that those two worlds are going to have to come together. I think theater will find its explosion then, because then writers can say, well, I don't need to write long form anymore. I don't need to write a 2.5 hour play. What I need to do is construct a depiction that encapsulates the controversies of the modern time, whatever those might be, and create a way to dampen the passion of righteousness. Because once you know something enough, like once you know of a topic sufficiently, at least if you watch like YouTube videos and you read about these, like, you know, people with, you know, tenure and they've been like studying these concepts, or biologists that have like won Nobel Prize, what's interesting is that their underbelly, the undergirding of all this is doubt. And the only reason they have so much of it is because they have fostered it by such a high absorption of information about the topic that they're interested in. And because they're into that, they know that things are not simple. It takes ignorance for things to seem simple, because you want things to be, you need to ignore things for things to be simple.
What's scary about what you're saying, and this will be another show we'll do, is it's having me think about AI, and the fact that, taking some of these concepts, and there want to be people, and there are already people out there just plugging them in, and they get a whole, I don't know if they've done plays yet, but it's going to be coming. The play, you're directing the upcoming one, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Give a shout out, if you would, to some of the other people in the cast.
Yeah, no, for sure. We have Hilary Fleming, who's playing our Hamlet. Mark Sawyer is playing
Okay,
Polonius.
I know more.
We have Chris O'Connor and Darlene Cobb that are playing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Jim Powell's playing multiple roles, the Ghost, one of the players. Yeah, no, they're a fascinating. They're a fascinating cast. They have been incredibly adaptive to what I would probably privately call the mania of my method. Just because it's a theater in the round, and it's not usual, so there was a lot of choreography that happened on the front end of things. And when writing it, I reconstructed scenes, I merged scenes together. I made a scene decontextualized from the original setting. So there's a scene where Hamlet is like being sent away to England, and he oversees this battle happening with these two, forces. And, he's talking to one of the generals, and I converted that into the scene in which Ophelia commits suicide, and made those words work as an extension of the relationship that Hamlet was having with Ophelia, plus the relationship that Ophelia was having. And Ophelia is by Alana Updegraff, who's kind of a newcomer, but taking on like a really significant responsibility of the play, because she represents in a way the emotional mania of the collective of everybody involved. It's sort of like a commentary, metaverse on the dysfunctional nature of this particular family and its political underpinnings. And so the direction has been from highly choreographed and then loosened, so that people can then, once they know their landing spots, can start to find the organic nature of their little internal private conversations, or their own little internal physical dynamics. Because since everybody for the most part stays on the stage that are in the scene, but even some peripheral characters, there is this thing in which the audience is surrounded by the cast. The audience is not seeing them. They actually cross into their periphery. They sort of draw back. They'll share, a line with the person where they're sitting, and they'll be having these moments where they'll like look up, and I go, hey, that's going to happen. Telling my cast members, like, that's going to happen. So there's no standing by. This doesn't stop. You're Rosencrantz, you're Guildenstern, you're Ophelia, you're Polonius, you're Hamlet. You don't stop until the show is over. And so, yeah, no, yeah, Lori, I think it's Lori Corda. She's playing Gertrude. An amazing, like, I would call it like a social lubricant in a way, because like the moment she goes in, like everybody starts to do this jelly thing, and everybody starts to like have these organic interplays. And that to me is where like I feel the audience will lose themselves into the tour de force nature of it. You know, there will never be sufficient information for like the way that the original play happens. You kind of know what to expect, so it's a game of anticipation, waiting for the major soliloquies, waiting for the the murders and so forth, and you're just sort of sitting through a lot of talking to get there. And in this case, it's a disorienting. Like I was saying earlier, I think that great writing happens where the first thing that you do is that, like, for example, we start on scene 3. I think it goes like scene 3, then 1, 2, 5, back to 4, then we're on to 2. You don't even see the merge, you know? So
Out of all the things you've done, Anthony, I hear a lot of different things, but acting, directing, script writing now. Do you have a particular preference as to what you like doing best?
I think I'm falling in love with writing. It's a weird relationship though, because it's not been an amount, it has not been an aggregation of a lot of different works. It has been vignettes. And I'm starting to see the forest from the trees, especially in this process doing Hamlet the Requiem. Like I started to really discover first the potent nature of Shakespeare's blank verse. Like the mastery of language is not something that is just because of its aesthetics. I started to really understand that there is a way to say 4 things in one sentence. There is a way beyond subtext. There is a way beyond, there's irony, but there is a lot of universalism. And I'm starting to fall in love with this idea that, well, one, that the portability of a writer is a lot easier than all the trappings of having to do productions, whether it's theater or it's film. But I'm happy that I'm within the auspice of this Shakespeare and Friends group, because I feel what's going to start happening is an incubation, sort of the way that there was a figure, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who is a notable candidate to possibly being Shakespeare, but he wrote a script, he had a scriptorium. And what he thought best was like the amalgamation of brilliant ideas and brilliant minds makes one great play, rather than it takes one mind only. And I find that that is also part and parcel to this theater revolution, where it is very segregated. It's incredibly siloed. In fact, the focus of a lot of this new diversity stuff is just giving people the opportunity to be in those silos themselves. And it's not necessarily a true sense of diversification where it's like, no, like the cultures need to mend. There needs to be the nuances of the overlays. There needs to be the juxtaposition, so to speak, of these contradictory human nature capacities, and seeing how they come to play to depicting the 21st century. Because I don't really feel there's a lot of plays yet that have depicted the 21st century. I think we're idealizing the past at this point, or condemning it. That's pretty much what we're doing. We're creating a religiosity around the idea of theater, instead of saying, what if this was actually an extension of conversation? And what if this was the best way to offer somebody a controversial nugget without asking them to take partisan lines, so that they can privately assess for themselves through the experience of a depiction what it is they feel now about a certain matter. So I would say that writing is the one that's winning the race at this point.
And after this production, what's down the road for Anthony Abraira?
Probably finishing a play called Blue Limbo, which is a 3-person cast piece about the purgatory, basically. But it's a religious dissertation, a presentation of spirituality, its limits, and its caveats. I see 4 seconds on our meeting.
So this is something you wrote, though, right?
Yes, I've been writing. Yeah, been writing it for about a year, and this process with Hamlet Requiem has elucidated where I'm like, oh, I know where I can take this now. I needed this play to bring this into the foreground, and definitely going to produce it with Shakespeare and Friends. So be on the lookout for that.
Okay, and to recap,
sure.
once again, Anthony, the dates of the upcoming play and how
Absolutely.
to get tickets.
Tickets, Eventbrite. Just look up Hamlet Requiem, Requiem. They're going to be the 14th through 15th at Asheville, at the L Asheville venue across from the Masonic Temple, where I had done Glengarry Glen Ross a few years back. In Spartanburg at the Mayfair Arts Studio, the 16th and 17th, and then we'll wrap it up on the 21st through the 24th in Tryon at the Tryon Depot. And those tickets are available on the Eventbrite website, or they can go to shakespeare-friends.com, and there the opening banner is Hamlet. They can just click there and that'll direct them to where they need to go.
Okay. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for being my guest, Anthony Abraira, on this Blaine's World podcast. Also,
Thank you
like
for
to
having me.
thank my producer, Cappy Cassetti, and hopefully we'll actually bump into each other. Well, we miss each other at Glengarry, but we'll hopefully actually sometime meet in person. That'd be great. Thanks for your time.
I insist we do. Take it easy.